A flight to remember. The plane hummed softly as it moved toward the runway, the powerful engines beginning their familiar roar. Lisa Jackson was still processing the events that had unfolded only moments ago. She had been asked to move from her seat in first class, a seat she had booked well in advance. The manner in which the flight attendant had spoken to her, dismissive and quick to judge, had not only caught her off guard but also triggered a swell of emotions she hadn't expected to feel. She had been confident, poised. This was supposed to be a smooth flight, a few hours to herself before a busy workday ahead. But now, with the brief interaction with the flight attendant lingering in her mind, her quiet dignity seemed to be the only thing holding her together. Lisa's thoughts began to spiral back to other moments in her life when she had felt similar judgments cast upon her. It was a constant, unspoken weight, something she had come to terms with long ago. As a black woman navigating a world that often treated her as lesser, she had learned to anticipate the looks, the whispers, the quiet resistance from those who couldn't, or wouldn't, see her for the person she truly was. Yet, moments like these still stung. They always did. She pulled her focus away from those thoughts and looked around the main cabin, noting how it felt different from the first-class section she had just left. The seats were tighter, the people less refined. It wasn't that the passengers were any less worthy of the flight, it was simply that the space felt more impersonal, more crowded, and less comfortable. She settled into her new seat, glancing out of the small, round window beside her. The world outside was a blur of gray skies and distant clouds, but inside the cabin, it felt as though the air was charged with tension. Lisa could feel the eyes of the other passengers, some filled with curiosity, others with pity. They had watched her leave first class and move to the back of the plane without a word of protest. Her quiet dignity was something they couldn't fully understand, but they were watching nonetheless. It was the kind of gaze she had become accustomed to over the years, one that studied her, tried to make sense of her, and failed to see the whole picture. There were murmurs among the passengers as the flight attendants continued their preparations for takeoff. No one had dared to say anything directly to her, but the discomfort was palpable. The realization that a woman of her stature, dressed so professionally and with such a commanding presence, had been forced to the back of the plane was not lost on them. There was no grand confrontation, no loud outburst. Lisa had simply walked away, and in that silence, a story was being told. She crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that was more out of habit than out of any sense of need for protection. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and the flight attendants hurried to finish securing everything before they could finally take off. Lisa tried to focus on something other than the recent unpleasantness. She dug through her bag and pulled out a novel she had been reading for a while, one of those historical fiction books that allowed her to escape into a world much different from her own. But the words blurred in front of her eyes. The hum of the engines grew louder, and her thoughts drifted. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, but there were moments like these that reminded her that despite her successes, the world would always view her through a lens shaped by bias and prejudice. She had faced discrimination more times than she cared to count, and while it didn't define her, it certainly left its mark. And yet, she always rose above it. Her hands gripped the book, but the words no longer seemed to matter. What was the point of losing herself in fiction when the world around her was unfolding in ways she couldn't ignore? Her mind wandered again to the flight attendant, the woman who had so casually dismissed her from her rightful seat. What had motivated that action? Was it the color of her skin? The way she carried herself? Lisa could never know for sure, but she had seen enough to understand that it was never just about the surface. There were always deeper layers, histories that people brought with them, whether conscious or unconscious. In that moment, as she sat in the cramped seat in the back of the plane, Lisa made a silent vow to herself: she would not let this moment define her. She would rise above it, as she always did. No matter how hard it was to maintain her composure, she would not let the ignorance of others take away her peace. The plane started its journey down the runway, gaining speed with every passing second. Lisa could feel the familiar sensation of weightlessness as the wheels lifted from the ground and the aircraft began to climb higher into the sky. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, savoring the feeling of leaving the earth behind, the worries of the world slowly shrinking below her. But just as the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign flickered off, an unexpected announcement came over the intercom. The captain's voice, warm and confident, cut through the quiet of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we begin our journey, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to my wife, who's seated at the back of the plane. She's a beautiful, strong woman, and I'm proud to have her with me today. If you happen to see her, give her a wave and say hello. We've been together for years, and I'm lucky to call her my partner in life." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. It wasn't just a casual announcement, there was something personal in his words. The captain's voice was full of affection, pride, and love. It was a small, unexpected gesture, but it caught the attention of every passenger on board. As the captain's words echoed in the cabin, all eyes turned to the back of the plane. The quiet murmurings of the passengers gave way to an unspoken understanding. Everyone in the cabin, from the front to the rear, turned toward the same spot. Lisa followed their gaze, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the rear of the plane. And there, seated a few rows behind her, was a woman who stood out among the crowd. She was dressed in an elegant dress, the soft fabric a contrast to the standard airline uniforms. Her hair was styled with precision, and her posture was impeccable. She seemed almost out of place in the cramped rows of the back cabin, yet there she was, the wife of the captain, the woman the flight crew had been talking about. In that moment, Lisa realized the full extent of the situation. The flight attendant had misjudged her. She had wrongly assumed Lisa didn't belong in first class, but the truth was, it wasn't just Lisa who was being underestimated. It was everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Lisa was no different. She was a woman who had worked hard to get where she was, and no one, no flight attendant or biased passenger, could take that away from her. But the truth of the matter was that life had a funny way of turning situations on their head. The captain's announcement wasn't just a small gesture of affection for his wife, it was a subtle reminder of who was in charge here. And it wasn't the flight attendant. It wasn't the passengers who had silently watched Lisa move to the back of the plane. It was the quiet, unspoken power of the captain's words that changed everything. The realization swept through the cabin like a gust of wind, shifting the mood entirely. People began to look at each other in disbelief. The seat had been taken from Lisa, but now, the real question was, what would happen next? The shift. The plane settled into its flight, the noise of the engines blending into the background as the passengers resumed their quiet activities. But the announcement made by the captain had rippled through the cabin, leaving a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new kind of awareness. Lisa, who had settled into her seat at the back of the plane, could feel the subtle change in the mood. It was as though the very fabric of the flight had been altered by a single, seemingly innocuous declaration. She glanced around the cabin, noting the furtive looks that now lingered on her. The passengers had turned their attention away from the captain's wife but remained aware of the woman who had been asked to move. Lisa sat upright, her back straight and her posture poised, as though nothing had changed, but inside, she was processing what had just transpired. The exchange with the flight attendant, the polite yet firm insistence that she vacate her first-class seat, what did it all mean? Was it truly an innocent mistake, or had something more insidious been at play? She knew it was impossible to pinpoint exactly what motivated the attendant's decision, but one thing was clear, this was no ordinary situation. The captain's announcement had only drawn attention to the fact that Lisa was now in the back of the plane, a place where she didn't belong, at least in the eyes of some. Her being moved felt like a subtle reminder of the racial dynamics that often played out in spaces like these. A black woman, elegant and poised, being relegated to the back of the plane as others looked on. She wasn't just a passenger to be moved, she was a statement. But as the plane ascended higher, with the clouds rolling beneath them, the realization began to settle in. This was not her battle to fight today. Not here, not now. She would remain composed, as always. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was, would pass. Life had a way of moving on, and so would she. Still, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about the whole situation that felt off, as though the universe was forcing her to confront her place in the world once again. The injustice wasn't just the act of being asked to move, it was the subtle, systematic way that people like her were still treated as if they didn't belong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of the intercom crackling again, this time with a voice she recognized, the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice echoed again, this time with a more somber tone, "I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience some of you may have experienced earlier today. We strive to make every flight as comfortable as possible for our passengers, and I am aware that certain situations can make things feel less than ideal." The cabin fell silent, and Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Was he apologizing for what had happened with her? The entire plane seemed to lean in, waiting for what would come next. She could almost feel the passengers' eyes on her once more, the focus shifting back to her. It was as if everyone was now aware of the underlying discomfort, and they were waiting for the next step. "I also want to thank you for your understanding," the captain continued, his voice growing warmer. "In my many years of flying, I've seen that life can be unpredictable, and sometimes, circumstances shift in unexpected ways. We're all on this journey together, and I want to assure you that every one of you is valued and respected on this flight." Lisa felt a pang of recognition. She had been on flights before where the captain's voice came over the intercom in a similar manner, attempting to smooth over any potential discomfort. But today, there was a different energy in the air. It wasn't just a routine announcement, it felt personal. It felt like a response to something specific, something that had happened just moments before. For a brief second, Lisa wondered if the captain had noticed the tension she felt, or if he had simply been addressing the collective atmosphere of unease. After all, he had spoken about his wife with such pride, and now, he was acknowledging the discomfort the passengers had experienced. She wondered if anyone else had caught the subtle message in his words. Did the captain understand what had occurred? Did he realize the weight of the situation, or was he just trying to smooth things over for the sake of politeness? The captain's wife, seated near the rear of the plane, seemed unaware of the stirring conversation. She sat with a calm demeanor, flipping through a magazine, her face unbothered. Lisa studied her for a moment. She had been the focal point of the captain's announcement, the woman he had proudly introduced to the passengers. She had no idea that just moments earlier, the very seat she occupied had been the subject of such tension. The thought crossed Lisa's mind that perhaps the captain didn't fully understand what had transpired in the front cabin. After all, he was up front, busy with his duties, while the flight attendants handled the passengers in the back. But that didn't change the fact that the attention was now on her. The flight attendants who had once barely acknowledged her now watched her with a different kind of scrutiny, their faces more composed but tinged with a sense of caution. It was as though they were waiting for her to react. Lisa was keenly aware of the power of perception. In this confined space, where people from all walks of life were trapped together in close quarters, every glance, every movement, seemed to carry meaning. She could feel the weight of the eyes that now followed her, the unspoken judgment that lingered in the air. Her mind began to race again, wondering if this was yet another microcosm of the larger world outside, where the small moments of injustice added up to something far greater. But Lisa was no stranger to these moments. She had been here before, in countless other situations where she was asked to prove her worth, often without the chance to speak a word in her defense. But that was the thing about people who had worked as hard as she had, who had fought every step of the way to succeed. They didn't need to explain themselves. They didn't need validation. They knew who they were. The flight continued on, the rhythmic sound of the engines becoming a comforting backdrop as the hours slipped by. Lisa remained in her seat, her thoughts drifting between the mundane tasks she would tackle once they landed and the sudden and unexpected shift in dynamics aboard this flight. The captain's wife was still quietly reading, oblivious to the subtle undercurrent of the situation unfolding around her. But Lisa was not a passive participant in this world. She was a woman of action, and she knew how to navigate the complexities of the world around her. Her gaze never wavered. She maintained her composure, her poise, and above all, her sense of self. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, Lisa couldn't help but wonder, would the flight attendants, the captain, or any of the other passengers ever fully understand what had happened today? Could they ever grasp the weight of the moment? Or would they simply move on, as they so often did, unaware of the subtle but significant shifts that had taken place in their midst? One thing was certain, though, this flight would be one she would never forget. The silent power of observation. As the plane sailed through the clouds, the sense of calm that had begun to settle in the cabin was punctuated by occasional sounds of conversation, quiet laughter, and the soft shuffle of flight attendants moving down the aisles. Lisa Jackson leaned back in her seat, her thoughts far from the distant hum of the engines. Her gaze wandered out of the small window, looking at the vast, endless sea of white clouds below them. The soft glow of the sun touched the tops of the clouds, making them appear as though they were floating in a sea of gold. But inside the cabin, things were far from serene. She had seen the way the other passengers had reacted to the captain's announcement. Some had looked away quickly, others exchanged glances with one another, and a few had tried to cover up their discomfort with polite smiles. But the truth was clear, a shift had occurred. The flight attendant who had asked Lisa to move was now moving more carefully, her movements deliberate and measured. She had stopped passing through the aisles so quickly, as if she, too, was aware of the change in the air. The passengers, too, had become more conscious of the space they occupied. It was as if the entire cabin had taken a collective breath, a moment of quiet realization. Lisa understood. She understood the power of observation better than anyone. It was something she had learned from years of experience, watching how people moved, how they looked at one another, how they responded to situations. It was all part of the unspoken language of human interaction. And right now, she was the subject of that unspoken language. But what truly caught her attention was the sudden sense of solidarity that seemed to form in the cabin. It was subtle, but it was there. The passengers, now aware of the injustice that had unfolded, began to adjust their behavior. They no longer seemed as dismissive or distracted. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. They were not ignoring her anymore. In fact, many seemed to be paying closer attention to her, perhaps even out of guilt. Lisa couldn't help but wonder if any of them had been complicit in the flight attendant's action, if any of them had seen the moment unfold and remained silent, too uncomfortable to speak up. She wondered if they were all now trying to make amends in their own way. Were they acknowledging the quiet dignity with which she had moved to the back of the plane? Or were they simply uncomfortable with the lingering tension? It didn't matter. Lisa wasn't here to seek their approval, and she certainly wasn't here to teach them a lesson. She was here for one reason, to reach her destination. This flight was just another brief chapter in the many moments she had lived, each one contributing to the larger narrative of her life. And yet, as she sat there, she felt the unmistakable sense of a story unfolding. Her story. The story of a woman who had learned how to navigate the complexities of the world, always with grace, always with dignity. The story of a woman who refused to let anyone define her by the color of her skin or the perceptions they held. At the same time, Lisa couldn't help but think about the flight attendants and what they must have seen. She had felt their gaze as they passed her, trying to gauge her response. The flight attendants had been trained to handle difficult situations, but how could they have known what to do in this case? They were not prepared for a situation like this. They were trained to serve, to make people feel comfortable. But that didn't always mean they understood the complex dynamics that came with serving people from all walks of life. Especially when someone challenged the status quo. Lisa had heard murmurs among the staff as they made their rounds. There was a noticeable tension in the way they interacted with her. It was a hesitation, an uncertainty in their voices as they asked if she needed anything, as if they weren't sure how to approach her now. The once confident, almost dismissive flight attendants seemed to be second-guessing themselves, unsure whether to engage with her at all. Lisa recognized this for what it was, guilt. They were likely aware that their colleagues' actions had been wrong, but no one knew how to rectify it. The moment had passed, and now they were left to deal with the consequences in their own quiet ways. Lisa appreciated their attempts to be more polite, but she didn't need their guilt. She didn't need their apology. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the flight attendants, a young woman with short blonde hair, stopped at her seat. She was carrying a tray of drinks, but her eyes were fixed on Lisa. The polite smile she offered seemed strained, almost as if she was unsure of how to act. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am?" she asked, her voice tentative. Lisa didn't respond immediately, studying the woman for a moment. The flight attendant shifted nervously under her gaze, clearly waiting for Lisa's response. The silence stretched on for a few seconds, and Lisa finally nodded, choosing a glass of water. "Thank you," she said softly. The flight attendant's eyes flickered with something, relief, perhaps, or simply a desire to do something, anything, to fix the uncomfortable air between them. "Of course," the flight attendant replied, her voice just a touch more confident now. She placed the glass in front of Lisa and walked away, her movement slightly faster than before, as though she couldn't wait to get back to the safety of her duties. Lisa took a sip of the water, her gaze returning to the window. The sky outside had begun to change, the blue deepening into a richer shade as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The cabin light dimmed in response to the evening's arrival, the soft glow from the overhead lamps casting a gentle light on the passengers below. Her mind, however, was still preoccupied with the situation. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger, after all, would have been too easy. It would have been a reaction based on the emotion of the moment, something fleeting and easily dismissed. Instead, she was focused on the bigger picture, the broader narrative that this small episode contributed to. Her life wasn't about the petty moments of judgment that people threw her way, it was about how she responded to them, how she used her experiences to grow stronger, wiser, more resilient. Lisa shifted in her seat, glancing toward the back of the plane, where the captain's wife still sat, reading her magazine. Lisa wondered if the woman knew what had just happened, if she understood the kind of shift that had occurred, the kind of tension that had been lifted with that single announcement. She wondered if the captain's wife would even care, or if she was too wrapped up in her own world to notice the nuances of what was unfolding. But then again, Lisa wasn't interested in answers anymore. She was content simply observing, watching how the world moved, and learning from it. The longer the flight continued, the more Lisa began to realize that this wasn't just about the seat. This was about something far larger, the invisible systems that governed human interactions, the way people saw each other and made judgments based on assumptions. And this moment, as uncomfortable as it was part of a larger story that she was living. It was a story that would continue long after this flight ended, a story that would evolve and grow, just like she had. And in that moment, Lisa made a quiet decision: she wouldn't let this moment define her. The story of her life was still being written, and she knew exactly who she was. It was the flight attendants, the passengers, the captain's wife, they were the ones who would be left trying to figure out how to reconcile what they had seen. The unexpected revelation. As the hours passed and the plane steadily continued its journey toward its destination, the cabin seemed to fall into a deeper quiet. The soft murmur of conversation dwindled, and passengers who had been previously uneasy about the unfolding events had begun to settle into a more routine demeanor. Most of the flight attendants had resumed their duties with a sort of practiced calm, and the once tense atmosphere that had lingered following Lisa's move was now nearly imperceptible. But for Lisa, the entire experience still simmered beneath the surface. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the soft vibration of the plane beneath her to lull her into a meditative state. It wasn't that she hadn't experienced discomfort in her life, far from it, but what had transpired today on this flight was different. It was a subtle, insidious reminder of how the world often saw her, even in the most mundane spaces. Her thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendants began preparing for the in-flight meal service. The plane, now well into its journey, was cruising at a steady altitude, and the passengers were beginning to shift in their seats, pulling out books, settling their trays, and adjusting their blankets. Lisa could sense the slight bustle in the air, an activity that should have felt comforting. And yet, the moment felt strange, as though it was only a distraction, an interruption from the true shift that was taking place in the cabin. The stillness of the event was almost palpable. As one of the flight attendants approached, her face slightly flushed, Lisa realized that this time, the woman's steps were not those of uncertainty but of purpose. She came toward Lisa's row with a calm but resolute demeanor. Lisa watched her, her thoughts once again drawn back to the earlier exchange. Was this flight attendant coming to apologize? Did she realize the weight of her own actions? Or was she simply doing her job? The woman stopped at Lisa's seat, her gaze meeting Lisa's with a hint of familiarity. It was the same attendant who had asked her to move earlier, the one who had seemed so assured in her initial demand. Now, however, she seemed almost nervous, her smile tight and forced. "Ma'am," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say that I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. It was a misunderstanding, and I—" Before she could finish, Lisa raised a hand, gently halting her. "It's all right," Lisa said softly, her tone composed but firm. "No need to explain." The attendant seemed relieved, her posture relaxing slightly. "Thank you for understanding," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was just... well, it's not every day we have such a situation, and I'm embarrassed. I hope I didn't cause you any distress." Lisa offered her a small smile, but inside, she was still processing everything. She knew the flight attendant wasn't being insincere, but the sudden shift from the earlier confrontation to this apologetic tone still felt somewhat hollow. Lisa didn't need anyone to apologize for her. What she needed, perhaps, was for this kind of situation to never happen again. But she also knew that wasn't realistic. Not in this world. "Thank you for saying that," Lisa replied with a gentle nod, sensing the woman's genuine discomfort. "I appreciate it." The attendant, still standing, seemed unsure whether to say more. Her hand fidgeted with the drink cart she was pushing down the aisle, and after a brief pause, she continued, "It's just that, you know, we have a very strict policy about seating assignments, and I think that was all it was. But I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Lisa nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Strict policies. She had heard that excuse before. It was an easy explanation, a convenient one, but it didn't account for the nuance, the unspoken judgments, the subtle biases that often determined how people were treated. It was clear to her now that the flight attendant had simply followed protocol, but perhaps that was the problem. Following rules blindly without consideration for context or humanity. It was something she had seen time and time again, not just in the aviation industry, but in life itself. The attendant finally walked away, but Lisa didn't feel any sense of closure. She knew the encounter had been necessary, but it was still just a small part of the larger picture. The real work, she believed, was in the unspoken understanding that would follow. There were still questions, unasked and unanswered. Would the other passengers ever truly grasp what had occurred? Would they reflect on the deeper layers of the situation? Or would it fade into nothingness, just another fleeting moment? As the meal service continued, Lisa glanced over at the captain's wife. She had yet to notice the subtle shifts around her, still engrossed in her magazine. It was almost as though the woman were untouched by the events unfolding around her. Lisa wondered if she had any idea of the power dynamics at play. If she had ever experienced the kind of treatment Lisa had faced. It wasn't an accusation, not really, more of a quiet curiosity. The captain's wife was the epitome of privilege, untouched by the complexities that Lisa navigated daily. But that wasn't her fault, Lisa thought. She wasn't the enemy. She was just another person living her life in the way that was easiest for her. The meal service continued, and the flight attendant returned once more, this time more focused on her task than on any lingering awkwardness. Lisa allowed her mind to wander as she ate, thinking about her journey ahead and the challenges waiting for her once she landed. The flight, though seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, was a microcosm of the world she would return to, a world full of contradictions, inequalities, and human behaviors that sometimes seemed to contradict themselves at every turn. And yet, there was also beauty in that world. There was still kindness, understanding, and growth. It was easy to get lost in the darker aspects of life, but Lisa knew that as long as she kept her eyes open, as long as she remained observant and aware, she could find the light. And maybe, just maybe, by living in that light, she could help others see it too. As the meal service came to a close and the flight attendants began to clear the trays, Lisa noticed the captain standing in the aisle, his face serious but calm. He was talking quietly to one of the attendants, and there was a moment when their conversation paused, and Lisa found herself staring directly into his eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to place something. His gaze was calm but searching, almost as though he were recognizing something he hadn't fully understood earlier. Lisa felt a strange flicker of connection, something unspoken passing between them, before he returned his attention to his duties and moved toward the cockpit. And then it clicked. The captain had seen the shift. He had noticed the unease, the unspoken tension that had hung over the cabin like a cloud. He hadn't just apologized out of politeness. Something had changed in him too. Maybe, just maybe, he would be the one to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again. Maybe his understanding would lead to action. For now, Lisa was content to observe, to continue her journey, and to live her truth. She had no illusions that the world would change overnight, but every moment of awareness, every conversation, every small act of defiance, those were the things that could eventually add up to something larger. And as the plane soared through the skies, Lisa leaned back in her seat once more, the quiet hum of the engines carrying her thoughts toward the horizon. Lisa's journey, however, had only just begun. The unseen bonds. As the evening deepened into night and the lights of the airplane dimmed to accommodate the sleep of weary travelers, Lisa sat quietly, her mind still spinning from the events that had unfolded earlier. The world outside her window was now a deep indigo, the stars scattered like distant diamonds against the velvet sky. The rhythmic sound of the plane's engines was the only constant, lulling the passengers into a quiet stillness. Yet within the walls of the cabin, something had shifted. A kind of unspoken energy hung in the air, one that connected every individual on board in an invisible web. Lisa had long been aware of the subtle connections that bound people together, connections that went beyond the obvious ones, the physical ones that could be seen. It was in the way people responded to each other, the way small interactions unfolded into larger, more intricate patterns. But there was something about the moments that had taken place on this flight that seemed to have woven a deeper thread, a shared understanding among the passengers. Her thoughts wandered back to the earlier apology from the flight attendant, the quiet, almost awkward gesture of kindness that had followed the unsettling incident. The attendant's words, though meant to smooth things over, had left Lisa with an impression that was still lingering. What had truly been said between them? Was the apology an attempt to erase guilt? Or was it a moment of vulnerability, an attempt to acknowledge the unspoken hurt? Lisa wasn't sure, but she did know this. It had been a rare moment of humility in a world where people often failed to recognize their mistakes. But the real shift had come not in the apology but in the captain's subtle acknowledgement. Lisa had felt the captain's gaze on her earlier, his brief, almost imperceptible glance that conveyed more than any words could. He had recognized something in her, something beyond the surface. It was as if, in that fleeting moment, he saw the weight of the world that Lisa carried, a world that many around her could never fully understand. But his gaze wasn't one of pity or condescension. It was an acknowledgement, a silent respect for the resilience she had cultivated over the years. It was an understanding of something greater, something hidden beneath the surface. Lisa's mind wandered to the captain's wife once more. The woman had been so absorbed in her magazine, so cocooned in her own bubble of privilege, that she had seemed entirely unaware of the gravity of the moment. But Lisa wasn't angry with her. The woman wasn't to blame for the biases that were woven into the fabric of society, she was simply a product of it. It was the invisible forces, the quiet assumptions that governed the world, that had influenced her perspective, just as they had influenced the flight attendants and passengers around her. But what if this flight, this one simple interaction, was a catalyst for change? What if it was the small moments, the ones that went unnoticed by most, that were the true drivers of progress? Lisa knew that the change wouldn't come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It would come from the quiet, deliberate actions of individuals who chose to see the world differently. It would come from moments of vulnerability, from people choosing to listen and acknowledge the experiences of others, even when it was uncomfortable. As she pondered these thoughts, Lisa's attention was drawn to a soft noise from the back of the plane. She turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on the captain and his wife. The two were speaking quietly now, their conversation soft enough to be private but loud enough to be audible to those seated in the vicinity. Lisa's curiosity piqued, and she found herself instinctively straining to listen. The captain's voice was calm, steady, but there was an underlying tension in the way he spoke. He was trying to convey something to his wife, but the words weren't coming easily. Lisa could hear fragments of their conversation. "We'll need to be more careful, everyone's watching now, it's not just about the seat anymore," his wife's voice, soft and soothing, responded, but Lisa couldn't make out the words. But something about the captain's tone told her that he wasn't just speaking about the seat. He was speaking about something deeper, something far more profound. And in that moment, Lisa realized that the captain was wrestling with something inside himself. He wasn't just a figure of authority on a plane, commanding respect from passengers and crew alike. He was a man grappling with the same forces of bias and privilege that shaped the lives of everyone on this flight. And that realization, in a strange way, comforted her. Even those who seemed untouchable, even those who lived in the world of privilege, had their own struggles with the systems they had inherited. Lisa allowed herself to relax into her seat once more, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The gentle hum of the engines was almost hypnotic, and for a fleeting second, she felt herself drifting, not into sleep, but into a deeper state of reflection. The events of the day, the injustice, the apology, the acknowledgement, had all come together in her mind as part of a larger narrative, one that she was still unraveling. As the flight continued, Lisa noticed the change in the behavior of the passengers around her. They had begun to engage with one another more openly, perhaps out of a desire to fill the uncomfortable silence that had followed the earlier tension. The man sitting across the aisle, who had barely glanced her way before, now offered her a polite smile as he pulled out his book. A woman in the row in front of her, who had avoided looking her way earlier, now turned slightly to ask her opinion on the meal. It was a small shift, but it was a shift nonetheless. Lisa didn't respond immediately, but she noticed. She noticed the way the energy had changed in the cabin. There was no grand gesture, no moment of clarity, but something subtle had taken place. It was as if the passengers, one by one, were beginning to understand that the flight wasn't just about getting from one place to another, it was about the shared experience of humanity, the interconnectedness of everyone on board. The flight attendants, too, had begun to move with a different sense of awareness. They no longer seemed distant or mechanical in their movements. There was a softness to the way they interacted with the passengers, a heightened sensitivity to the needs of those around them. They offered their services with more patience, their smiles less forced, their voices less hurried. It was as though they, too, were coming to terms with the invisible forces that had shaped their roles, and now, they were choosing to step beyond them. And then, just as the night deepened and the lights in the cabin flickered, signaling that the passengers should prepare for descent, something remarkable happened. The captain, having finished his conversation with his wife, made his way down the aisle, passing near Lisa's seat. He glanced at her again, but this time, there was no awkwardness in his gaze. There was only a quiet, respectful acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you." It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Lisa nodded in return, her expression serene. She didn't need to hear any more words, didn't need any grand apologies or explanations. This small, shared moment of recognition was enough. It was enough to know that, in some way, change had already begun. And even though the flight would soon come to an end, the ripple effects of what had occurred would continue, quietly shaping the future in ways that could not yet be seen. A new beginning. The descent was gradual, as the soft hum of the engines shifted into a deeper tone, signaling that the plane was preparing to touch down. Passengers began to stir from their reverie, adjusting their seatbacks and buckling their seatbelts in anticipation of landing. Outside, the sky had transformed into a muted shade of gray, the sun now hidden beneath a blanket of clouds as they neared their destination. Lisa felt the familiar pull of gravity, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a different kind of weight, a weight of possibility, of change, of something quietly unfolding beneath the surface. She glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were lost in their own worlds. A few were reading, others had their headphones on, their heads slightly bobbing to the rhythm of the music. Some were scrolling through their phones, disconnected from everything around them. Lisa had always been keenly aware of how people tended to retreat into their own bubbles, particularly in a place like an airplane, where the isolation was both literal and figurative. But tonight, she saw something different. There was a subtle shift in the energy of the cabin. It was as though the tension had lifted, not in an overt or dramatic way, but in small, fleeting moments of awareness. People were looking at each other more often, acknowledging each other's presence. There was a quiet camaraderie that had emerged, one born of shared experience, even if that experience had been uncomfortable. It wasn't about the apology, or the seat, or the incident, it was about the ripple that had begun to spread among them. And it was beautiful in its simplicity. Lisa turned her gaze back to the captain, who had returned to the cockpit, his posture still as confident and composed as it had been when he first boarded the plane. But this time, there was something different in his demeanor. A certain softness in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the changes that had taken place, not just in the passengers, but in himself as well. He was a man of authority, yes, but he was also a man capable of growth, of seeing beyond the surface of things. As the plane began its final approach, Lisa felt the urge to take a deep breath, as if to ground herself in the present moment. Her fingers gripped the armrest, the familiar sensation of the plane's descent reminding her that, despite everything, she was still in control of her own narrative. The flight had been an unexpected journey, not just across miles of sky, but across an emotional landscape, one that had forced her to confront the complexities of the world in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her mind wandered again to the captain's wife, who had remained largely silent throughout the flight. The woman's magazine had remained her constant companion, her face inscrutable, untouched by the small moments of awareness that had passed through the cabin. But Lisa understood. It wasn't her fault, after all. She had lived a life that had been shaped by privilege, a life where the complexities of race, class, and society had largely been invisible. But maybe, just maybe, the events of this flight would linger with her, too. Maybe this small encounter, this moment of discomfort, would plant a seed in her mind, one that would grow slowly over time. The plane touched down with a soft bump, the wheels making contact with the tarmac. The cabin erupted into a collective exhale, the tension that had held its grip throughout the flight now dissipating in an instant. Lisa could feel the shift, as though the entire plane had been holding its breath and had just released it all at once. The flight had come to an end, but the impact of what had transpired was far from over. As the seatbelt sign flashed off and passengers began to gather their belongings, Lisa stood, moving with quiet grace toward the aisle. She noticed that many of the passengers, those who had once seemed so disconnected, now looked at her with a different kind of awareness. There were no overt gestures, no dramatic acknowledgments. But she could feel it. The recognition, the understanding, however small, however fleeting. The flight had changed them, in ways they might not even fully comprehend. When Lisa reached the front of the cabin, she saw the captain once more, standing near the door as passengers disembarked. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and once again, she saw the unspoken acknowledgement. He didn't say anything this time, but there was a slight nod, a gesture that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It was a moment of connection, not just between two people, but between two worlds. The world of privilege and the world of struggle, two worlds that had collided in a way that neither of them had expected. Lisa stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the bustling airport now alive with activity. She could hear the chatter of travelers, the sounds of rolling luggage, the announcements over the loudspeaker. But amidst all of it, she felt a deep sense of calm, of peace. It was as though the events of the flight had given her something new, something that couldn't be easily defined. A new sense of purpose, perhaps, or a new clarity about the road ahead. She wasn't sure, but she could feel it. As she walked through the terminal, Lisa was aware of the eyes that followed her. Some were curious, others disinterested, but all of them were part of the same vast, interconnected world that she had just spent hours flying through. The flight had been a microcosm of that world, an isolated, fleeting space where people could be their most honest, their most raw. And in that space, they had all experienced something together. She thought of the captain and his wife once more. Maybe they would leave the airport today, unaware of the deeper currents that had shifted within them. Maybe they wouldn't. But what Lisa knew for certain was that she would never forget this flight. It would stay with her, a reminder of the quiet battles fought in the spaces between people, in the spaces where the invisible lines of privilege and prejudice collided. And as Lisa stepped outside into the cool evening air, she felt a renewed sense of strength. The journey wasn't over. It had just begun.